And with that, I would love to introduce to you Nikolaus Weil, Executive Director, Singularity University, Germany, and CEO Mindex, talking about exponential mindset. Welcome, Nikolaus.
Thank you very much.
So, Nikolaus, I can spot a difference. So, I'll wear a suit, a tie.
A nice tie.
Thank
I like
you.
the tie.
Yeah, I go to the same shop like Colin, so we get more similar throughout the 3 days. So, what is the mindset that you are operating in? Would you be able to just get us this through this process?
Well, that's of course, first of all, good morning, everybody. It's a very good question, and if I would sort of summarize that in one word, it's openness. To be open for the change that's coming at us at a very rapid change and be adaptive.
Cool.
Well, I'm going to be talking about that. Yeah.
Great. Stage is yours.
Thank you. So thank you very much for having me. I know it's day 3, and you've already taken in a lot of information and you've had a lot of opportunity to network. And today we're going to be talking about culture, which I think is a very important part of the entire context around technology, because without mindset, without culture, without learning, technology to a certain extent is meaningless. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the exponential mindset, and that is the thinking that allows us to use technology as a means of transformation. And if you look at the press, particularly, by the way, here in Germany, digital transformation is one of those big words that you find all over the place. And according to CRISP research from last year, actually only 7% of Germany's executives really feel capable and prepared to go through digital transformation. So, to give us a little bit more understanding, it always helps to dive back into history and how transformation and technology have gone hand in hand. We started off at the Stone Age, and we were literally eating what we killed, everything that came up to our doorstep or cave step for that matter. And using fire, using tools, suddenly we started creating structured settlements. We started cultivating agriculture and dwellings. So the systemic change that went along with that infrastructure and that technology, if you will, was that we were no longer randomly utilizing nature, but we were actually creating the opportunities. We were creating the resources that we needed to meet our demands and our needs. If we go forward, and many think from a historian's perspective that this is one of the most pivotal key moments in history, is in 1450, when Johannes von Gutenberg actually invented the printing machine, and we were suddenly capable of reduplicating books and texts, which were very reserved, very limited, very scarce asset, reserved only to a few, clergy, royalties, and academia. But that alone didn't just do the trick. That is what was so decisive in that period, because most of these texts were still in Latin and really not accessible to the common people, to the simple people. So what the Lutheran movement did at the same time, they started translating these texts into common local language from Latin. And that, together with the technology, is really what created that transformating force and made information abundantly available to everyone. We fast forward to the year 2007. This is where we all remember, it's actually like a 10-year anniversary now, when Steve Jobs presented the iPhone. The device, that famous presentation, the device that could be a phone, that could be a camera, that could be the internet, loaded with a bunch of great applications. But it wasn't just the device. What it ushered in was the age of connectivity. And now, 10 years later, we have a 20 billion plus sensor economy. We're moving towards 50 billion connected devices. You heard that 2 days ago. And at some point, we'll soon also have reached a trillion plus sensor economy. So again, we're seeing that it's the technology, but also what it does in our environment and how it makes something that has been little, scared, reserved, limited, abundantly available. And what that tells us, that really technology over that period of time has always been that transforming force that takes us from scarcity to abundance. And only when it really happens on a massive scale, when it really happens exponentially, not just in little tiny incremental steps, then it truly is transformational. And that's what we at Singularity University look at, is the opportunities that we can capture with that transformational process. So before I go on with the exponential mindset, I want to give you a little bit of an introduction of what Singularity University is and what we do. Just by a raise of hands, has anyone ever actually heard of Singularity University or maybe even done one of the programs? Okay, so there are a few. We've still got some work to do. Singularity University was founded by Silicon legends Ray Kurzweil and Peter Diamandis in 2008. And the organization really devotes itself to applying and exploring accelerating technologies and how we can use them to solve some of humanity's real grand challenges. I'm going to be talking about that in a second. So we offer a very wide host and scope of different education programs, conference formats. Actually, we have a 2-day summit happening here in Berlin on May 3rd, May 4th, that you might want to check out if you are in Berlin. We have a very vibrant global community worldwide of alumni, and we also have accelerator labs. We have an expert faculty and, of course, a lot of technology-based curriculum. Now, if you Google the word singularity, there are a lot of definitions, if you look it up in Wikipedia. The way that Ray Kurzweil defines it is really that moment in time when artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence. I actually like to keep it with the definition of Kevin Kelly, who's the founder of Wired magazine, who once said, singularity is that moment in time when the developments of the past 10 million years will be superseded by the developments of the next 5 minutes. At Singularity University, we believe that significant breakthroughs will be achieved in 5 key areas of technology, which are artificial intelligence and robotics, biotechnology and bioinformatics, network and computing system, medicine, neuroscience, nanotechnology, and digital manufacturing. They will not only advance by their individual features in terms of performance, cost efficiency, availability, but also by the way that they synergize and interconnect together. And we use these technologies. We have this amazing opportunity today to actually harness these technologies to solve what we call the grand challenges, which amongst others are environment, food, health, education, prosperity. And when we encourage our communities to apply these technologies to solve these grand challenges, we really try to have them focus not only on the technology, but also on social factors, contexts of economic issues, environmental issues, political issues. And by the way, one of our real great representatives and alumni is very passionate about his project, is actually one of your very own of Cisco, Mirko Boss, who 2 days ago presented his project Medibus, which head-on tackles the grand challenge of health and how it can be, and medical treatment can be made available in the refugee crisis. We believe that the biggest problems in this world are in fact the biggest opportunities. So the way that we measure our outcomes and our transformative purpose is really when we ask the question, how can we impact 1 billion lives within 10 years? And to give you a little bit better sense of how we do things at Singularity University, I brought along a little trailer on a documentary on Singularity that has just recently been released. AV, if I could have the film for a moment.
Here's a quote. In the past century, there were more changes than in the previous 1,000 years.
The rate of change is explosive to the point that our ability to understand the implications of it is going to be out of our grasp very soon.
Our intuition about the future is linear, not exponential. It makes a huge difference.
The impact of these things is completely unpredictable.
We can't know what the future is going to be, but we can influence the future.
I had sort of a very simple metric now I use, which is, are you working on something that can change the world? Yes or no? The answer for 99.99999% of people in the world is no.
What if we created a university focused on the exponentially growing technologies? I called Ray and he said, great idea, let's do it. Welcome to SU. Pleasure to have you here. Ray? We're off and running.
The mission of Singularity University is to bring together people from many different backgrounds who are aware of exponential growth of information technology and to really address the implications of that so that we can understand where society is going.
I'm one of the guys trying to build a quantum computer, and it's really rough going.
Every week in China, a new coal plant is built. Every single week. It's going to triple its consumption of energy.
The idea behind the team project was having these incredible students actually put their learning to work. Pick a project that will affect 1 billion people positively in 10 years.
If we could generate 10 ideas, can they impact 1 billion people? Can they positively impact 1 billion people?
Think about that, the fact that literally a group of students can touch the lives of 1 billion people today. 30 years ago, that would have sounded ludicrous. Today, we can point at dozens of companies that have done just that.
Can we inspire people to focus on it long enough and hard enough to go and make it happen?
I think 9 weeks to change the world is an awfully big burden.
We think we are going to sit here as a group like 40 people and agree? That's naive.
If you don't like the idea, then that's it.
Forget the disagreement. Let's just be friends and work together. This doesn't work like this.
You've got to do 3 things to be successful. You've got to create like a god, command like a king, and work like a slave.
Changing anything that we've done for decades is risky. Once we stop taking risks, we basically have hampered our ability to innovate. The world's biggest challenges can be solved. That's a mindset. We are living in such a risk-adverse society that it's killing us.
There is no problem that the intelligent human mind cannot overcome. None whatsoever.
We may have something really, really good here.
So obviously with change and transformation always comes a lot of fear. And that's one of the most common topics that we always engage with when we talk to people about exponential change. And this picture here is probably pretty scary to a lot of people when you see that lost little soul, that person in the middle amongst all that automation and machinery. So a very important part of our mission is really to create deeper understanding, context, and facilitate a constant dialogue to get a better understanding of what technology actually can mean in terms of its opportunities. Because we truly believe that pretty much 60% of the jobs that we know today will no longer exist in the future. And a lot of the jobs that will exist, we don't even know what they look like. So more and more, we will become dependent on focusing on our unique skills, our creativity, in order to stay abundant and not become redundant. So what we also try to do is to maintain this narrative and make technology accessible to people that don't have a technology background. And I think this is also important with a room of experts, as here, is that we actually always try to engage them and take them along on that journey. So sometimes you might hear me taking an example where you're thinking it's lame or it's boring, but it's really, see this as an opportunity also when you talk to people that are possibly not that technology savvy, to take them on that journey into the future. So I want to unpack that term abundance a little bit. And despite the fact that we still have some tremendous challenges out there today, we have clear evidence that abundance is not just a fantasy concept somewhere in the future, but it's actually already happening. If you look at child mortality, it's decreasing. If you look at poverty, you have less and less people living under $1.25 a day. And experts believe that by the year of 2030, that number can well be going towards zero. At the same time, there's more and more literacy. Basic education is becoming more and more available. We believe that exponential technology is allowing us to make more gains in the next 20 years than it has in the last 200 years. And we will soon have the ability to meet the basic needs of every man, woman, and child on this planet. By the way, another very simple model of looking at abundance, if you look at this vast area in northern Africa and the Sahara, it shows actually the minimal space that is necessary to provide solar energy to the world, to the EU, or even that little tiny square to Germany. So what does exponential actually feel like? What is that sensation? It's acceleration, it's speed, it's velocity. It's a way of measuring growth, and it's a way of measuring the rate of evolution. So when we think linear, we think in what difference does 1 centimeter or another year make, or another whatever. And when we think about, let's say, a bacteria colony, would we ask the question, what difference does 1 more bacteria make? Or would we ask the question when looking at a hard drive, what difference does 1 more gigabyte make? It's much more useful when we think exponential to ask the question, when is there twice as many? Now here's a simple math model to sort of illustrate what exponential is really all about. And let's assume for a moment we'd be walking 30 paces, each 1 meter. Then by the law of math, that is simply 30 meters. Now let's assume we're taking exponential paces, which is every one of those paces, we're doubling the amount of steps we're taking. Is there any guess of potentially how far we've then traveled? 100 kilometers? Raise of hands, 100 kilometers? 1,000 kilometers maybe? Any idea? I would actually, if someone can guess it, I'll put out a bottle of my red wine from my wedding that I just had last year. Still no? Okay. It's 26 times around the Earth. That's the way also we need to apply our thinking. So let's go back to that acceleration effect, and let's assume this empty lake here is the brain's volume to calculate per second. And let's assume that every one of those drops of water going into that empty lake is the brain's power and capacity doubling every 18 months. What we see for a very long time, nothing happens. But then suddenly, we have that acceleration effect, and then the lake is very quickly full. Now, obviously, I'm not going to bore a room of IT and computer experts with Moore's law, which I think has its limitations anyway. But again, taking that acceleration effect and applying that to the price-performance curve of what $1,000 can buy us in terms of computing power, we again see that over, let's say, a theoretical time span of 100 years. We see that for a long time nothing happens, and then suddenly that curve kicks in. And the interesting thing is that curve is sort of happening right now. That's where we are right now, where that exponential movement, that accelerating movement is starting to take its path. And many believe that by the year 2060, which I actually think is really truly when we're going to have singularity, at least under Ray Kurzweil's definition, is when that computing power is going to equal the entire equity of the brains, of human brains on this planet. Now, going back in history, and I'm assuming I'm not telling you anything new, but Cray 1, the first supercomputer, which was released in 1975 at 9 million, which today, inflation adjusted, would be somewhat around 35 million, at 80 million floating operations per second used to observe the atmospheric changes. 2016, by comparison, we have an iPhone at 172 billion floating operations per second at merely $750. That little device, just as a matter of context, that gives us more information at the palm of our hand than Bill Clinton had during his entire presidency. And we can go on. Here's a Drive PX2 used to power autonomous driving at under $1,000 at 24 trillion floating operations per second. So 300,000 times the power that Cray had 30 years earlier at 1/35 of the price. Now, what's much more important is the trajectory that comes out of that history. I wasn't trying to do computer lessons, obviously not, but it's really what does that do in terms of forecasting and looking into the future. We've sort of become pretty good at looking at individual technologies and predicting what path they potentially could take. But what happens when they suddenly start coming into the market together? They reassemble, they morph together. Then suddenly that becomes a complete different exercise. And we call that unexpected convergent consequences. And to just give you a little bit of an anecdote of a story, how unexpected these outcomes can sometimes be. The picture you see here is a little boy that unfortunately, due to an accident, lost his arm and received a prosthesis. Now, the boy was pretty bored by what this tool could do because it wasn't really very cool. It couldn't do a whole lot. So we got together with a Chicago-based designer of, I think, Colombian background, and they got in touch with Lego Labs the innovation unit of the Danish toy manufacturer. And they created a new version of that artificial limb, which suddenly, and by the way, they were using the robotic system of the Mindstorm toy line. So the new version of that artificial limb that they created was something entirely new and very cool, because suddenly you could attach all kinds of toys, Star Wars troopers, laser lights, and so forth and so forth. So obviously this became a very unexpected but new experience for the child. And also at the same time, Lego is now suddenly in the business of creating medical devices. Now this, of course, makes the future for a lot of us very confusing, for some people very scary and very uncomfortable. But also, for a lot of us, it's very exciting because it is hard to predict. One way or another, I believe that what we need to be prepared for that future is really to be adaptive and resilient. Let's look at some other of these transforming technologies that are out there right now. Here's an example of 3D printing and robotics for a self-printing bridge, a project that's scheduled to happen in the Netherlands this year. It's going to have 8 meters, so just imagine walking through a self-printed bridge. Here are some examples of robots that can recognize emotions, that are used in senior care homes, dressed like a bear, or even the Modi, which I just actually ordered myself, which helps you enforce positive habits and recognizes when you break some negative patterns. Here's an interesting story that some of you might have read about last year from the AI scene, which shows Lee Sedol, the defending champion, world champion in the game of Go, playing AlphaGo, the DeepMind computer purchased by Google. And what you need to know about the game of Go, it's actually a fairly simple war simulation game, which was created in China 2,500 years ago. But when you look at the potential option of moves, you compare it with chess. Chess has an opening move, or number of opening moves, that are around 21. By comparison, Go has 361. When you aggregate all the potential moves of Go, you end up with a number that's larger than all the visible atoms in the universe. So it is notoriously difficult for AI to actually play. It's also called the holy grail of AI. So the AlphaGo team challenged Lee Sedol, and everyone thought it was just a question of how high he would win, but it was no question that he would win. But then something very surprising happened, because AlphaGo was constantly learning from its previous matches, from other computers, from other players, very high-level players, not at the level of Lee Sedol, but it also started playing, it started learning, because it never sleeps, obviously, while it was playing Lee Sedol. And surprisingly, it won 4-1. And the interesting takeaway from that experience is really, if artificial intelligence can beat us at something as complex as Go, then it is virtually hard to imagine all the opportunities that open up with it. And how interesting it is to see how AI is already mimicking us in our human behavior in terms of our curiosity and our eagerness to push forward. Here's a very important transformative technology that we really spend a lot of time at Singularity looking at as well, which is the blockchain. Not only because it allows us to transfer money easily and securely from A to B, but because as a decentralized ledger, and as a database, it uses consequential information that we can always rely on without any intermediaries, without a counterpart. So what that does, it changes our entire concept of value, and it puts us into an opt-in society, which is why many believe that this could be the next big thing after the internet, because it really gives us the opportunity to really decide when and at what value we make available our information in terms of our health data, our private data, our real estate data, our equity data, and so forth and so forth. So it really changes the way how we as a society and as individuals interact and create transactions in the digital age and IoT economy. Here's another interesting example for 2 reasons. This is called Magic Leap, and it's an ultra-secretive project based in Florida. It already secured the investments of Google, Alibaba, Andreessen Horowitz. And what it does, it really takes virtual reality to the next level. What it does, it uses a photonic chip to infuse light directly into the retina. And it creates an illusion of depth, and it also creates a much more seamless experience between reality and virtual reality. Pairing this with a very lightweight device and hardware, it's a completely different experience than, let's say, Oculus Rift or HoloLens. And then you combine that with consumer data. You can imagine what then suddenly happens in terms of experience. You walk into a coffee shop, and they immediately recognize how you like your latte or your cappuccino. But the interesting thing about this story is why I also mention it, is the fact that there's some very critical coverage about it right now, that potentially it might fail, potentially it might not be able to deliver to the level of expectation. And of course, there's a big community and an outcry that says, well, we knew it right from the beginning. But what I think is so important, that if you can come up to this level of progress, then at some point this will happen. And it's a little bit like Thomas Edison when he invented the light bulb. It didn't work out in the beginning. Same as Christopher Columbus. When he was looking for the West Indies, he actually found America. And I think this will happen, and others will capitalize, even if it turns out to be a failure or on a lesser level of performance. Here is a project that we're very proud of at Singularity University, which is called Made in Space. It was created by graduates from our Global Solutions program. And what they did is they took a simple 3D printer that Lowe's, which is an appliance store in the US, a chain which sells pretty boring stuff like screwdrivers and appliances, and they explored and looked into what are the challenges in actually 3D printing in outer space. And what you need to know, of course, is that 3D, being able to print objects in outer space can dramatically and significantly reduce the amount of payload and cargo and the costs that are involved with that and traveling into outer space, particularly those first few miles and trying to overcome the gravity zone of the Earth. So it has big impact. Now, the way that, or what most of these technologies all have in common, is a certain pattern of evolution, and we measure that with what we call the 6 Ds. We start with digitizing something. Then, in the beginning, it's still very deceptive, and I'm going to talk about that in a second as well. We start dematerializing assets. We demonetize them. Things become cheaper. Just think about how expensive the first cell phones were, and how cheap a burner phone is today. They become very disruptive. We think about the iPhone moment. And then we democratize, because it does become available to everyone. Here's an interesting example. And by the way, this is a table from a book from one of our founders, Peter Diamandis, called Abundance. And it shows a list of features that if you would have owned those 20 years ago, like a Sony Walkman, a video conferencing device, GPS, video players, medical libraries, and so forth, you would have easily been spending up to $1 million. And the same thing applies to the storage capacity that today Evernote, WhatsApp, or even Dropbox provides to us for free. Now, going back to that concept of deception to disruption, what's interesting about a lot of these young new companies that use exponential technologies, they begin pioneering and innovating in that space under that white line, which is where it's still deceptive. It's easy to miss because it goes along with a lot of frustration. There's failure. It doesn't work out in the beginning. And then at some point you have that iPhone moment where they break through. They start disrupting the market. They create amazement. They create chaos. And that's when those very established companies that are moving on that white line, that linear path, which we also call the path to doom, for them it's then very hard and difficult to catch up with that innovation. And that is where the big opportunity for a lot of those young companies and unicorns are. Now, here's some examples that we all know how that digitization and dematerialization process has replaced some of the very traditional outlets, such as record stores, bookstores, long distance. Now, an example that we always look at in this context, of course, is also Kodak, which used to be the premium photography company in the world, until it filed for bankruptcy in 2012, left only with $100 million worth of market cap and 17,000 employees. And at the same time, you had a company called Instagram, which emerged with only 13 employees, and within 3 years had a market cap of $1 billion. Now, it's not that Kodak didn't know that that technology was coming, and it wasn't that Kodak didn't have that technology. They just didn't believe that change would come. And they thought their position, their market position, was so superior that they didn't really have to mind. So it's one of those famous examples of opportunities missed because of mindset. So what we're seeing on the right side of this chart is that more and more these young companies, these unicorns, are crowding into that space of companies that are founded for $5,000 and then quickly become $1 billion companies. And we're seeing more and more S&P companies being replaced by those companies every other week. So the question is, what makes these companies so different? What makes these young companies different from the established companies? It's obviously their capacity to innovate quickly, zoom out into a business strategy, zoom in, quickly experiment, develop something, prototype, use agile and lead methodology. But it's something more important, that how they really transform. And it's they use a concept that one of our faculty members nicely describes as actually John Hagel, describes as scalable learning. And I'm going to unpack that concept of what that actually means a little bit. If you go back and look at how many major multinational big organizations justify size, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm just saying where a lot of that concept came from is that in order to reach your objectives and goals, it's much better to have a lot of personnel, it's a lot of resources, a lot of infrastructure. It gets you to your target much easier and quicker. But now, in these exponential times, where technology is developing so quickly and accelerating, we're seeing that it's becoming more and more important to use something called scalable learning. And it's drawing in that incredible talent war, finding the right people, where you actually see that the organization learns, you as an individual learn, the teams learn. That's become a much more important factor. And we've modeled out what that scalable learning journey could look like. And when I talk about learning, I don't mean education. And the difference, as some of you might know, is that learning is really when you do something yourself. And education is when you're told to do something and then reproduce it, which is, literally in the sense of the old Prussians, is how they developed education. So we start with a challenge. We think, again, problems are the greatest opportunities, and we don't have to go into a classroom. It actually makes a lot of sense to just use your everyday workplace, your environment, as your classroom. From there on, we have to really check into the mindset. We have to ask the question, why are we actually tackling this challenge? Then we have to open up that space of creativity, ideation. We visualize, we experiment, we start prototyping, we start modeling out something, and even if it doesn't work at first, but we come up with a solution at some point. And then we come to a very important part, which is communication, because all that solution doesn't really help if I can't collaborate, if I can't integrate that into a communicational process. Once I've done that, it's important, and one of the key elements of also adjusting is really adaptiveness, is breaking patterns that go along with my old solutions or probably old problems, and also being resilient with that. And I see so many people that burn out in today's world, particularly the older they get, and trying to keep up with that technology. So I think literally in a physical health sense, it's important to be adaptive and resilient, which is why I think that corporate wellness is becoming such an important issue. Once we've done that, we come into the integrating part, which is where we repeat. And as we all know, there's a saying that says, repetition is the mother of all skills. And that's also when we start peer-to-peer teaching, which Cisco is also so great at. And the more we do that, the more we're better and we start mastering. And this is a repetitive cycle. And we can apply that not only to our workforce, we can apply that to our customers, we can apply that to our service providers, any potential stakeholder. And of course, we amplify that learning effect, that scaling learning effect, when we use some of the simple digital tools that are out there to use content, to collaborate. And Spark, by the way, is a great example with the Spark Room to do exactly that. So when we also talk about mindset and we talk about learning, it's always important to remember moonshot thinking. And I'll give you a quick summary on what moonshot thinking is from Singularity's perspective. And it's not so much about traveling to the moon. It's much more about the approach that we take when we want to solve a problem. And remember when John F. Kennedy in his famous speech said, we chose to fly to the moon. It wasn't so much about this is the goal that we're going to reach. And many didn't really believe that it would work out. It was much more about taking and inspiring an entire nation to go along with them on that journey. So the mindset that brings with it is to think 10x bigger and not just 10% bigger. And it radically changes the fashion of how you want to tackle a problem, even if you don't know how you're going to get there yet. But it makes it solvable right from the get-go. Someone who was really great at doing that was Steve Jobs. And in the book, Becoming Steve Jobs, there's a concept called the reality distortion field. And those of you who are Trekkies will probably remember that this is, I think, from a Ferengi episode where it's really how you bend reality. And Steve Jobs was really great at doing that. He could actually create a reality that would motivate people to go on this quest to achieve objectives that were hardly imaginable and impossible. It would also, of course, describe the way that he was in terms of the dark side of Steve Jobs, who could be very ruthless in accomplishing his goals. So with that, my best way of sort of tackling the future is when I say the best way to predict the future is to create it. And that was a quote by Abraham Lincoln. And I know that this is not the best time to be quoting American presidents, but I'll do it anyway. And I'll leave you with this final question. What future do you want to create? And I'll give you a little bit of insight on my future, which is this little fellow. This is my son David, and he's 10-month-old. And he was born actually on the last night of our first summit conference right here in Messe Berlin last year on April 22nd. I literally rushed off I rushed out of the conference into the hospital where he was born. A lot of my partners and colleagues call him the exponential boy. And what I find so interesting about that picture is the fact that everything that I talked about for him is going to be boring. It's going to be history. And he'll tell me, Dad, I use Magic Leap or whatever it is going to be at that point in time. We use that in history. I talked to Christopher Columbus today, and he's already going to be busy working on a complete different new future. And I hopefully will be able to have him as my teacher. With that, thank you very much for having me here, and I'm available at the coffee break. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nikolaus. So, your future leader that we just saw there, who will teach you some new skills, how does that resonate with today's world? So what does the new future leader look like in a scalable organization, and how can we get there?
Well, I think it's really important that a leader embraces failure. He has to have a good eye for explorers. He needs to be an explorer himself. He needs to be that Christopher Columbus type. And I think still in many organizations, failure is still considered something entirely bad. You have a lot of politics, and I just take the liberty to talk openly about this. But I think if we use failure and mistakes much more as an opportunity, and we have the leadership that embraces that and pushes that, I think we can find tremendous amount of information and learnings out of failure.
Okay, sounds good to me, definitely. But working for a large enterprise corporation, I think failure is something what is not put into the DNA there. So you're always driven, and it sounds more like this lean approach, the startup approach. So how can we change as an enterprise organization to really go into that scalable organization where we allow failure on all levels and really learn from that?
Well, obviously, it is a challenge to integrate innovation and transformation in an established organization, which is naturally very busy with managing its operations day to day. So I think when you start with an innovation, it's probably easier to go somewhere on the edge rather than start in a core area with a lot of P&L relevance. It probably makes more sense to go to that edge and to avoid something that we also call the immune system, where you have always in every context enemies of change that will try to take that opportunity down, and you try to work on that edge and see how that works out, and even have that edge use its very limited, scarce resources, which pushes creativity much more.
Okay, interesting. So we do have one more question that I noted down. So with the digitization, there is currently a big debate about universal basic income. So many people call it disrespectfully money for nothing. So what's your thought about that one?
Well, I think in one way or another, we already have a lot of that. Here in Germany, we have Hartz IV, and there's a lot of different models and concepts of social welfare. But I think in this world that I try to picture and illustrate today is I think that check every month is not really going to help anyone. It's going to be much more about how can we make resources available? How can we make opportunity to learn how to work with exponential technologies, infrastructure, and all the resources that you need to have access to that opportunity, like in the Gutenberg moment. I think that's going to be much more important than just money. My
Interesting.
personal opinion.
So Nikolaus will be here at the coffee along with some other colleagues from Singularity University. Also, we have Mirko Boss with us, an alumni of Singularity University. So if you do have questions, approach them. You can also raise these questions in the Spark room and keep the conversation going. We will utilize this power of the connection further on. And
by the way, I just wanted to, because you were just mentioning Mirko Boss, I think when I just talked about that cycle of learning, Mirko's project, Medibus, and also the container that he worked on in the earlier stage is an amazing example of how that cycle can actually work. We can talk about that later.
Great. Thanks, Nikolaus. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye, thanks.
So with that,